Season 4 of Notebook on Cities and Culture is brought to you by Daniel Murphy, Polar Inertia, a journal of nomadic and popular culture, online at polarinertia.com, and by Press Up, friendly web consultants who listen to your goals and provide solutions that make sense, online at pressupinc.com. Whenever you fly into or out of Los Angeles, what goes through your mind when you see the central theme building of LAX?
That I am stepping around, not through, but around a rather strange artifact of our jet age future.
And have you ever been in? It's not easy to get in.
I haven't, and in fact, I think it was just this past January that they closed the restaurant.
The non-revolving restaurant?
Yes, the non-revolving restaurant, kind of like, I don't know if you've ever seen Larry Sanders' show, but the Hanks
yes.
Revolving restaurant.
That never quite worked.
Yes, exactly.
This is Notebook on Cities and Culture. I'm Colin Marshall, sitting down here nowhere near LAX, really, in Culver City with Matt Novak. He is the founder of Paleofuture, a site about the future of the past, or the past of the future, which I guess is the present, but about concepts of what times ahead would look like from the 1880s to the present, envisioning everything from the 20th century to 23rd, 24th, 25th. The sky's the limit on how far humans have been willing to predict. But when they were doing their predictions, building things like the theme building in the 60s, what future did they see?
Well, it depends on who you ask. The 60s is a really interesting time, if only because we've always been sort of fascinated with it because baby boomers have made us fascinated with it.
They will be fascinated by this.
But they've also brought along a lot of myths with them. Back when I started the Paleofuture blog back in 2007, it was just a writing project for... I was going to school in Wisconsin at the time, and back then I had a lot of these myths ingrained in me about where's my jetpack style futurism. You know, that's the mantra of the retrofuturist. Where's my jetpack? Where's my flying car?
Why are those two? Why is it always jetpacks and flying cars? I mean, those are not... You think about it, the user experience of those two things would not even in the best of times be great, right?
Sure, and I think that's what makes them exciting. I think it's part of the mythology of the individualist American West almost. It's the and personally I find it very interesting why the flying car, the jetpack, these personal transportation devices took off as this sort of futuristic vision rather than, say, mass transit. Why was monorail or new, why was the hover bus not the thing that we grabbed onto?
Yeah, certainly Ray Bradbury did a lot of campaigning for a monorail, but even a future envisioning visionary, to use a clunky term there, like him, couldn't sell it.
Yeah, no, he couldn't, and it's interesting because, you look at sort of his campaigning in this city for the monorail, and the fact that he I did his last interview before he passed away, and talking with him about it was interesting, to learn that he had never driven a car before.
Especially for someone of his generation, that's like, are you sure you're American?
Well, are you sure you want to live in L.A.? Was the more appropriate question.
In that era, yeah. When he came here in the 50s, you'd think he saw the 50s here, the 60s here, the 70s here, the 80s here, and the 90s here. So the worst possible decades to not drive in Los Angeles. He lived through them.
Sure, and I think that there was sort of this disconnect between his politics and sort of what he thought could get done with that kind of infrastructure in the private sector. He wanted the monorail to pay for itself, and he thought that it could, insofar as there wouldn't need to be massive government investment. Obviously, that's not the case, and that's not even the case for the automobile itself. I mean, that you need the infrastructure of a reliable highway system to get cars around. So, so I guess, the 1960s is a time that we focus on, but have many myths about, because these baby boomers keep repeating them. They were kids at the time, so we had this, say, myth that the Apollo program was incredibly popular. A recent, if you were to ask someone, okay, what percentage of people supported the Apollo program and the funding for it, people would probably guess 80, 90%. It was actually hovering between 35 and 45% throughout the 1960s. And that throws a wrench in this mythology that we just decided, we're going to go to the moon, and we did it.
Some collective American push to space.
Right. And I think that that's really interesting to acknowledge, because there's a lot of different lessons you can take from that. One is that anything you want to do, you have to fight for, because obviously this was a huge fight within internal government organizations, within the culture at large, within governments. The Cold War was obviously the driver that got us to the moon. But it also takes tremendous spending by governments to build these things that then the private sector, I'm a believer in public-private partnerships, like the people that want to latch on to something like SpaceX, a private space company, and say that they should replace NASA, don't understand how these things actually work. They have no idea that there's no incentive for SpaceX to just get people to space. They're a contractor of NASA at the moment, and I would applaud them if they wanted to do private vacations on the moon, but that's not going to happen anytime soon. There's no market for that, and that's what there is a market for is them shuttling goods from here to the International Space Station, at least at the moment.
Right. You find a need and fill it, I guess. There is a theme anybody will notice after reading Paleofuture long enough, even beyond the sort of jetpacks, rocket cars, moon colonies envisioned in the early 60s, that humanity sucks at predicting the future. But is that true, or is it true that we have a selection bias for outlandishly wrong predictions of the future? Are we just more fascinated by the wrong stuff, or is it all wrong stuff?
I would accept both answers equally. It's a Rorschach test insofar any prediction is a Rorschach test. Right. It's the reason that psychics can get away with why do people believe in psychics for any number of techniques they use? Cold reading. There are, but we remember the hits and forget the misses. Which in the world of psychics, is helpful for them. But in the world of sort of what I'm looking at more specifically, which isn't just technological. I'm also interested in social futures, and that's often what's most missed, when you look at the Jetsons, for example, which is actually a parody of futurism. We forget that the Jetsons was actually parodying all of these visions of the future from the 1950s and early 60s.
It was a satire, lame though it could sometimes be. It was a satire.
Certainly, but if you're 5 years old, a baby boomer, watching this for the first time, or through the many reruns of the 1960s and 70s, when I tell
80s and 90s,
and when I tell people that it only ran for one season, they're absolutely shocked.
Yeah,
it
didn't run 30 years. What?
So it ran from 1962 to 1963.
Which is the year you would expect.
Exactly, which is sort of our mythologized golden age of futurism.
Many of us are still living in 1962 and 63. I mean, especially with Mad Men, and all that our minds are really put back in that era now.
Precisely, and I think that it's interesting to look at artifacts like that and sort of re-examine, well, what was missing. We focus so often only on the technological, and that's interesting, but more often than not, it's the social that we miss. So, but to get back to your original question, every prediction, if I post a prediction without much comment, I find some prediction about the internet, for example, predictions from the early 1970s about what the internet was going to look like, because the ARPANET, the first ARPANET node, the first host-to-host connection was actually made here in LA with Stanford in 1969, building this sort of fetal internet. And you look at predictions from that era of the early 70s, and they predicted all sorts of things, online banking.
It's always about looking at stock quotes too. For some reason, that always seemed to be a huge thing. Like you'll be able to pull up stock quotes. Like if that's the one thing they could securely imagine people doing in the future is looking at stock quotes at home.
Well, and I think that's because of the history that the stock ticker itself was an early mechanical.
It had a precedent.
Yeah.
People, Scrooge McDuck had the ticker in his office, and you could see examples of that. They could project from that.
Well, I remember, I'm probably going to mess up the dates here. I don't remember if it's the 1900s or the 1910s, but there's some Life magazine cartoon that comes to mind where this guy is in this pastoral scene with what's assumed to be his wife and kid, and he's looking at this stock ticker. And it's this mechanical machine that he's staring at and ignoring his family, which obviously has shares many of our concerns today about how we are so absorbed in technology.
I guess it's the iPad in the update of that cartoon.
Precisely. Everyone's staring at their phones on the bus or phones in movie theaters. But I think that when you look at a prediction and I see, and it's rather benign and very open interpretation, you can see whatever you want into it. Yeah, okay, so you take a given example of a prediction from 1900 about, say, the invention of air conditioning. There's an article in the January 1900 issue of Ladies' Home Journal by this guy John Elfreth Watkins who predicted all kinds of things. He predicted the eradication of animals; they'd only be in zoos. He predicted the elimination of certain letters that we'd get rid of. I believe it was Q and K. But long story short, he predicted a lot of things that were right and a lot of things that were wrong. He predicted, strawberries as large as apples. He predicted, but all of these predictions can also be interpreted in different ways, and they're not. If you want to stretch it and say, well, he foresaw the elimination. He foresaw texting language because of the elimination of these characters.
This is something Marshall McLuhan did very well. He said so much and so vaguely sometimes. He is still hailed as the predictor of the internet and a lot else, too.
Sure. And that's what's interesting to me for my own work when I look at, it's so hard to say this is the first person to predict this thing. You almost always have to hedge and say this is one of the first, because there is always someone else who had a slightly different take on it, but it's still very similar in a lot of ways. Whether that's the internet, whether that's self-driving cars, that's a common one that people have been obsessed with recently, it seems, because self-driving cars feel as close as ever, but they've been a promise of the future since the 1950s at the very least, but certainly, even in the 1920s, there was a guy in New York who was experimenting with a radio-controlled full-size automobile. So, it's and people get so obsessed with that sort of like first mentality, like the people in the comments section. This might be a sort of dated thing now, but you used to see people
first.
Yes.
I've never done that, but I know what you mean. And then a bunch of guys commenting, hey, fag, after that.
Exactly.
Right.
But
nobody predicted that about the internet.
Well, maybe someone might have, and that and that is what that interests me less, the sort of who's first, than sort of what it said about the predictor and the people that were making those predictions at that time. Because if you focus solely on, who predicted the computer, we could be we can go back centuries, mechanical computers in various forms.
It's not what they predicted, it's why did they predict it.
That's what interests me personally. Right. Why did they predict it? What did it say about the society, and what did they want to fix, or what did they want out of life? Because I think that, the study of past visions of the future sort of reveals vulnerabilities that we wouldn't be able to just sort of flat out say, I want this in society. It's you see this in genre of any kind. You see this in more hard science fiction. You see this in comedy, and it sort of takes the edge off it. A Charlie Chaplin film about immigration, he did movies that were very tough on the United States and its immigration policies and the way that we were treating immigrants at that time. But because it was done through this genre, through comedy, it made it less vulnerable, and it made it more acceptable to the people at large that were threatened by him just standing on, a soapbox and saying, "Hey, we're mistreating immigrants into this country.
We're doing it wrong."
Right. And I think you see the same thing in science fiction, which I cover less strict science fiction. I'm much more interested in what I'd call earnest visions of the future, but it's such a thin line that it's hard to define, and I'm often referencing things like Blade Runner or whatever it is, because that bleeds into the culture once it's out there already. So it's already part of the conversation, especially with the mainstreaming of sci-fi. You see sort of these reference points, which is why I'd argue that the Jetsons is arguably one of the most important pop culture artifacts of the 20th century, because we still use it today. I mean, it debuted in 1962, ran for one season, had a minor resurgence in the mid-'80s, and a movie in 1990, but we're in we're in the second decade of the 21st century, and we're still using the Jetsons as a reference for the future, which
is wrong.
Yeah, that's one way to look at it. Is something wrong? Like, is there something wrong with the way that we sort of absorb? I guess what interests me is why do we feel betrayed by the future? There is a very serious sense of betrayal that especially in baby boomers, these people that saw us land on the moon when they were kids. They saw the Jetsons. They were promised jetpacks very earnestly. Right. When I first started really seriously studying this topic, that was one of the questions that I had was, did people really think that they would be vacationing on the moon by the time they were an adult? And anecdotally, just because I asked this question of so many people, and I haven't found any real studies on it, anecdotally, yes. And it was because they were kids. It was because, when you're a kid and you're seeing all these amazing things. I mean, if you look at the economic growth of the United States in the 1950s and 60s, it was just incredible. And it led to all kinds of consumer goods.
This line keeps going up. Think of what we'll be doing in 20 years.
Exactly, and it's this sort of myth of exponential growth and even technological growth. People say, the future is coming as faster than ever, without realizing that we've been saying that for generations, and without actually sitting down and looking at tech adoption rates. I saw this piece recently online that I was pretty hard on because it was trying to show that new technology is being adopted faster today than it was over the last 100 years. So they had examples like radio and television, the internet. And it was showing what sort of the common wisdom was. It was showing that, yes, it took forever. It took X amount of years for television to take off from invention to widespread adoption. And it took this number of years for radio, this number of years for internet, and it just got quicker and quicker and quicker. It was intellectually dishonest, their numbers, because it was picking a year of invention, which is so hard to define.
This appeared right at this moment,
yes,
fully formed, and then was adopted over the next few years.
Exactly. And so if you pick, as they did, 1926 as the invention of television, of course it's going to look like it took a long time for TV to get into American homes. I assume they picked 1926 because that happened to be the first public demonstration in London of a mechanical TV. But it sort of speaks to how difficult it is to talk about invention. Television had a number of false starts. It was an incredibly complex technology for the 1920s. Then the Great Depression hit, and radio, the radio manufacturers that were most interested in it, RCA, were spending tons of money to in the product, and by the end of the 1930s, had a product that they wanted to bring to market, and then World War II hit, and then you've got this other leg, and then yes, after World War II, you see this rise from 1949, where it's just a handful of TV sets, to 1955, where I believe it got up to, that's where it breached 60% of American households. So I'm rambling here, obviously, but I think that it's the technology adoption can be spliced up in so many different ways.
Right. There's no one inventor, no one point of invention. Predictors of the future forget that things are invented organically. Then if we can say they forget one thing, it's that, right?
And they also forget that a lot of underdogs get screwed in the process.
Sure.
That's another thing that when I talk about transportation, you're talking about a lot of people that have to coordinate within a community to either build a road or build a monorail system or whatever you're trying to do. The same thing goes for the infrastructure of something like the internet. Right. The internet, back in the 1960s, there were a handful of nerds approaching companies like AT&T and saying, hey, we want to build this network. And because AT&T didn't see the immediate gains, they said, no, we're not going to do it. But thankfully...
Well done, AT&T.
Well, but thankfully, they got the funding. And this is an international story as well. Packet switching and all of the other technologies that were necessary to make the internet possible were happening in France and Britain, and there were a lot of other places that were not getting funding from their own governments. Our government saw an opportunity and were convinced to invest money in it, and it just so happened to be ARPA, now known as DARPA, the what is sometimes called mad scientist wing of the Defense Department. And they saw potential for resource sharing. There's sort of this myth that the internet was invented so that in the event of nuclear war we could still communicate, which isn't exactly right. Although there is, oddly, some truth to that later in the 80s where they were split off the MILNet, which it was another form of the ARPANET, and is another nerdy, stupid thing to look at in the 1980s. But they got funding. They built this network slowly but surely, and eventually it became this thing that became standardized through protocols like TCP/IP, and then the web in the early 90s, which is precisely why this article that I referred to earlier, they wanted to peg the invention of the internet somewhere in the early 90s, which was the invention of the commercial web when it was privatized, which is fair, but then you don't get to it was fair because that's when I got online. The early 90s, when my parents got the 100 AOL discs in the mail.
Yeah. Build forts out of them and whatnot.
Well, unfortunately.
50 free hours.
As a dumb kid, we'd chuck them in the lake to see how far they'd go when we were.
Simpler times we grew up in.
But, God, I think about that sometimes, how awful we were to the environment, that lake. That's when I got on. But there were a lot of other people on the internet before the early 1990s.
Right.
So
you go to Google Groups, you see those Usenet posts from 1981, talking about Blade Runner, a movie you've mentioned. It's wow, people were doing this. The internet discourse was not that different before I was born.
Precisely, and I think that's what's tricky about our folk heroes. We want to. I'm not sure how familiar you are with this sort of resurgence of Nikola Tesla.
Why do people love him so much?
Because he's the underdog. Because he at least he appears to be the underdog today, even though he was fantastically wealthy for his day, and only later in life, was not making much money. But there's sort of this narrative that was sold by his first biographer. The first biography about him came out, I believe, a year or two after his death in 44. I think he died in 43. And it built up these myths, like the fact that he died penniless, or that he invented all these things, or that he was, quite literally, he talked about him in godlike terms. Like, that's the beginning of the book. And so to rediscover, say, the first proper biography of Nikola Tesla and read this thing that paints him out to be this guy who got screwed out of all kinds of money, and some of which is true, some of which is not. You point to, you look at a guy like Tesla and you want to root for him because he was so brilliant and did contribute so much to our culture. But at the same time, there were any number of other people who don't get that recognition. There are thousands, literally, of Teslas in the world who
we'll never know about them.
That we will know about. We're going to know about a handful of them in the next decade because people are going to get bored with Tesla, and we need the next new underdog history story. And it makes for a great story. It makes for messy history if you want to tell it honestly, or as honestly as you can. But it does make for a good underdog story, and I think that's part of why it's hard for us to understand the invention of other stuff like the freeway system. There's no one inventor of our modern freeway system, but it's important infrastructure that is technology that shapes everyone's life in this country. Same goes for the internet. There's no one inventor of the internet. We can, Veep had I don't know if you watch the HBO show Veep, but
I've heard it's quite good.
It is good, and they had just a funny throwaway line recently about there was some scandal, and they one of the guys in the sort of crisis management office says, it was a classic 3-line setup. I want this done, and kill that asshole British guy who invented the internet. And they're talking about Tim Berners-Lee. And yes, he made tremendous contributions to how we use the internet, but he didn't invent the internet. It's we want to find that one person, that lone inventor. We want to believe that Steve Jobs went into his garage and came out with a fully formed iPhone. When in fact it took decades to develop what we now know as the smartphone. It wasn't, and that's what makes these recent lawsuits between Apple and Samsung so ridiculous. They're stealing from each other, and each one just through our broken IP laws are trying to claim, this beveled edge is ours, and that beveled, that screen technology is ours, and the pinch and zoom is this. And it's like, imagine trying to be a small player in that game.
Right. It reminds me of, it's something I only hear people above a certain age talk about, but it seems like they're always talking about the value of ideas, like, that's a good idea, don't tell anybody about it, you could make a fortune off that idea, or are they stealing, they'll steal my ideas. Nobody, and it seems like nobody under 50 talks about their ideas getting stolen. Do you know what I mean? There's a shift there. Like, I feel like an idea in and of itself is no longer broadly considered a valuable thing. We know it's about something else now.
I don't know that I'd agree with that.
Really?
I think that's a very optimistic take, and maybe I'm just less optimistic. I think that.
There's court battles that go on over, as you've mentioned, but it's sort of like, I feel like no idea is going to make or break me personally, right?
But there are plenty of people in the world that still believe that one idea is all they need to. It's the Silicon Valley myth. It's the myth of meritocracy. That all I need is that one idea and just a little bit of gumption, and I'm going to be a billionaire. And that anyone can do it, irrespective of infrastructure, irrespective of any other factors that actually influence the way that technology is adopted, that governments regulate the way that anything is functioning in our society. You're seeing these battles today over ride sharing, quote unquote, with Uber and Lyft and these other, Ayn Rand based initiatives that are not a cause but a symptom of a broken society. They are making us all freelancers. Everyone will soon be a freelancer thanks to the technologies that are, quote unquote, freeing us from. And this is where I start to turn into the reactionary, because I see these technologies as being perfectly fine if you're living in a functional society where government provides basic services for its citizens. We don't happen to live in that society. We live in a land of very fertile dystopias. So I have to object to, and there's no stopping it. Uber will win. The taxi companies will be, the mainstream taxi companies will be put out of business.
It's a matter of time now.
It is a matter of time, but what that does to people and sort of how they function when they go about their business, I think it's going to have a lot of unintended consequences. I think that people are going to struggle a lot more and not know why.
Because they were born into it?
Well, because we take so much for granted, and it's only human nature, you know. Like I've been in LA for 4 years now or so, and the highways are like the rivers. You know, we just assume they've always been there, and that they always will be there. And if you are a company like Uber, who only employs independent contractors as your drivers, and you take no responsibility for them, whether it comes to health care or legal responsibility if they were to, say, kill a little girl in San Francisco, or one of your drivers molests one of your passengers, as was just reported yesterday in LA here, you know, Uber gets to wash its hands and say, they're independent contractors. They are their own bosses. We just connect them with the people that, and that sort of hands-off approach to any society comes with certain consequences. And you know, I can bet there are plenty of people that will roll their eyes at that, well, why should Uber take responsibility for what other people are doing? Well, if we want to live in a civilized society, we have to accept certain premises. One of which is that if we want to live in a culture where we tie healthcare into employment, and we want private health insurance, then making everyone freelancers, making everyone independent contractors is a larger burden than if you have an employer that actually provides that for you.
To the extent that we live in a dystopia now, it's raises something interesting. You know, the Jetsons and all that, the stuff that baby boomers grew up on was utopian. It showed a utopia of a kind in the future, even though George Jetson was always getting stuck on his treadmill and what have you. But we mentioned Blade Runner, a dystopian vision of future Los Angeles specifically that came out around the time we were born. Our generation grew up on dystopias, right? I mean, the science fiction we watched, we read, was never very optimistic, was it?
Yes and no. It depends on sort of... And this is what's so dangerous about trying to classify generations, because, growing up in the suburbs of St. Paul, everything was pretty rosy in my little world. Like, some of my first favorite visions of the future were rather dystopian. You know, I remember T2. Loving Terminator 2.
Another dystopian vision of Los Angeles.
Right. I remember The Stand, which was, starts to weave in religious themes that were fascinating to me as a child because I grew up rather religious. But at the same time, if you look at sort of the banner headline, if you look at the billboard for the 1980s, it was boom time. Right. That's what we were sold. If you grew up middle class or upper middle class or wealthy in the 1980s, you remember that time. At least, I was born in 1983, so growing up in the 1980s, I remember the shuttle program. I was too young to remember the Challenger disaster, but I remember, this period of what would retroactively be called tremendous growth. Completely ignoring the fact that, it was a very hard period for a lot of people with the decline of manufacturing jobs, with the basically exploding homeless population, and cut back on services for the mentally ill, which, has basically turned that into our homeless problem. But until I studied the history that I ostensibly lived through, I thought the 1980s was a very optimistic time. Same with the 1990s. It was there were recessions going on in the early 1990s. I wasn't aware of them. I was 8 years old, and
your allowance was still coming in regularly.
My allowance was still coming in, and both my parents had jobs. And I was living in my own little bubble, and I got to experience the sort of weirdness of the dystopias and be fascinated with those. And I think also become exposed to a lot of the environmental dystopias that may not have resonated or weren't taught to baby boomers. I remember, things like, in the early 90s going to school, rainforest deforestation and...
Everything was about rainforests and drugs, as I recall.
Right. And acid rain.
Yes, acid rain and not trying marijuana.
Yes. But I don't think that... I don't know. It's so hard for us to... It's generations are a shorthand, and we want so badly through the medium of pop, through pop culture to define generations, and it's an easy thing for us to do. But just as we talked about earlier, not everyone was behind going to the moon. They thought it was a waste of money. You can find quotes from the Associated Press stories of the time of people saying, why are we going to the moon? It's a waste of money.
A lot of the subtext it often is, from what I can tell, look, the Soviet Union's going to collapse anyway. We don't need to trumpet over them. We can go to space.
Sure.
Right. With that, the idea being, and it's I hear it in conversations now. People talk about why is the space program so deflated in America, and the answer always seemed to me fairly obvious. Soviet Union's gone, but that answer doesn't seem to occur to a lot of people. Maybe it's the incorrect one. I don't know.
No, I think you're absolutely right. That why do we go to space? To prove that we could shoot missiles from space.
Right.
To prove that we could get our missiles to Russia. That's why we went to space. And take an example of, how can you tell that we're in a new Cold War? A lot of really dumb stuff like, journalist infighting over, the Olympics toilets weren't working and blah, blah, blah. But the real sign that it's a new Cold War was the Malaysian airliner that disappeared. And how nations reacted after that. China was the first to say, hey, look, we've got satellite images of what is probably the plane crash. It almost certainly wasn't. Right off the bat, I said, no, of course, of course that's not the plane crash. But what are they showing? They're showing that they can see from space this very detailed images, and Australia did the exact same thing the next week. The Australians, right now, they're
look at what resolution we have. No, look at our resolution.
Exactly. Australia has very tense relationship with China right now, and they're part of this new Cold War. And Tony Abbott, their current prime minister, is the George Bush of Australia. Did the exact same thing. I think he, did it 3 or 4 times. Hey, we found it. Look at these great photos we have of this wreckage. And all that was saying was, we can see everything from space. take that one step further, we are a dominant military, and the same thing for any other. North Korea has a space agency. I mean, that is
of a kind.
Yeah, they do. Well, no, they literally have a logo they ripped off from NASA of the space
saw that
agency
on Paleofuture,
and no one thought it was real because it was happened to fall on April Fool's Day, but the North Koreans don't have April Fools. But yes, that is. To prove that you can go into space, we want to believe that there are these clear lines between pure science and noble intention, but we have gotten a lot of face-burning technology to work for us in consumer electronics, and you saw this shift in the 1990s with DARPA dropping the D, the defense part of their acronym, in a move under the Clinton administration to try and signal that, yes, dual-use technology is important, that once we develop something for the military, that there will be private industry that can take that technology and use it elsewhere, whether that's in HD TV, which was a rather notorious failure by the military in the 1990s. They were really stuck on HD TV because it had dual use purposes. It could be used in the battlefield for more accurate vision of an enemy. And it could be then, hypothetically, pushed into the marketplace so that Americans could watch nicer TV sets. That hit a number of stumbling blocks and arrived much later in the U.S. than in Japan and elsewhere, but on the consumer end. But yeah, I think that there's never, even when it's not explicitly stated that there's a dual use, we have to acknowledge that when large institutions develop technologies, whether it's the internet, whether it's HDTV, whatever it is, that it's never a clean sort of, like, even if you wanted to say that Twitter is somehow pure, you have to look back at then the history of the internet itself, or even its culpability in the the government approached the founders of Twitter to create Cuban Twitter, ostensibly for the purpose of stirring revolt, which I don't believe, but that was the main narrative. I don't believe that, because I think that the actual goal was probably to stifle technological innovation. Because if you show, imagine being a startup in Iran or in Cuba right now, and you approach the government and say, hey, I've got this great idea for a product. It's going to be, say it's a Facebook-like technology, and it's going to be great. They're going to, the government's going to say, well, prove to us that you're not working with the U.S. government. So I think that
you're in the interrogation room at that point.
Right, precisely. It's the sheer amount of documents that leaked about that Cuba story and the Twitter. But sorry, just to get back to sort of this idea of purity and invention, it's harder to talk about, but it's the only way to talk about it. There is
the more interesting way, certainly.
It's the more interesting way, but it doesn't fit well in the current news cycle. Like, it's not a snappy headline to say that Edison invented the light bulb, but
yes.
like there's we have a 70 character limit at my. I work for Gawker Media, where across all platforms, our headlines have to be 70 characters.
That's harsh. That's half of a Twitter.
It is.
Twitter line, and I struggle with those myself.
By design. And so that, I have, I don't mean to rag on that particular constraint, because we have carte blanche to do or say whatever else we want in the world, but that particular constraint of the job is difficult to express nuance, and often because people just read the headlines, when I will write a story, I will get comments that prove that they didn't read the story. They only read the headline.
Right. Now I'm sure you know about something NPR did, which I think about like every day. That story.
April Fool's joke, yeah.
Yeah, the story where they posted just a headline saying Americans don't read anymore, and it got hundreds of comments, and I love how even people went along with it, and they knew there was no story, but they egged on the people who were just sort of voicing opinions without even intending to have read it, and it was, that was genius, right?
Oh, of course, of course, but at the same time, I don't know that it's a complete indictment of our culture at large, only because it's really easy to prove that, yes, people don't have time that we consume news in a way that is maybe not the best way, but if you're working a job and you have a family and you've got all these other concerns, it is a luxury to be able to sit down and read some 8,000 word piece on the nuances of how some thing was invented. Like
driving an Uber car 12 hours a day, it's going to be hard.
Well, precisely. If you're doing any job, especially one that creates the anxiety where if I don't produce something immediately, I am going to not get paid. Does that create a society in which we, I experienced this myself as a freelancer writing, when I moved, right after I left school, I was working a day job I hated in advertising, and then was kept up my blog as a side project, and then was approached by Smithsonian Magazine to come on with them, but it was a freelance position where I moved Paleofuture over in with them, and then started writing anywhere else I could, and as a freelance writer, half of your job becomes invoicing. Half of your job.
Doubt. And then following up a million times to make sure they send it. They see you send that out. You sent that out yet? Just checking. Okay. How about now?
And I'm incredibly lucky that I was approached by Gawker Media, and it was almost a year exactly that I've been working for Gizmodo now, and what a luxury to have something like health insurance and to have a steady paycheck. I mean, that's tremendous.
Probably get direct deposit and everything.
Yeah, I do.
Oh, man.
And I recognize how lucky I am, because I don't deserve it. Because I know that there are a billion other people who are just as, if not more deserving of that position in life. I've just been incredibly lucky my entire life, and have been able to exploit opportunities like, Gizmodo approaching me and saying, hey, do you want a job? And me being able to simply just say, yes, I would like that job.
Yes.
And then having the freedom to produce stories that I want to produce, that I can work on whatever I'd like, and there's absolutely nothing I can't write about. In fact, Nick Denton, who founded Gawker, encourages people to be instigators and be confrontational. So it's been a very interesting year for me, and I recognize exactly how lucky I am, and that it's an opportunity that I don't take for granted.
You mentioned a bit ago the freeways. Another example of something often written about as a dual use kind of. There's military uses to this, there's civil uses to this, and it was a huge project to build the freeways. And in Los Angeles, the freeways still get talked about more than in many places, partially because they're more striking here. I mean, to me, they seem like works of retrofuturistic sculpture almost, partially because I rarely drive on them. But it makes this city, along with stuff like the theme building, seem to me like a very retrofuturistic city. Do you see Los Angeles at all as sort of a concrete, sometimes literally concrete, past vision of the future?
I think so, only because it is a city of reinvention that somehow can feel stale. Like,
really?
It's the city that stereotypically is constantly reinventing itself, and in the people, the tens of thousands of people that move here all the time want to reinvent themselves. I mean, I'm a perfect example. I have never had any desire, well, maybe when I was a little kid, but never had any desire to be in movies or to be an actor or do the stereotypical things that people in LA stereotypically do. They move here for the entertainment industry.
They mostly come here to become entertainment journalists, and they're on their way at the E! Network. But no, not you. You didn't come from Minneapolis, St. Paul to do that.
No, I came because I just wanted something big and weird.
That's kind of why I came too, just because of the pure fascination of the place, right?
It's so broken in so many ways, but it's, again, a symptom, not a cause. LA is not a cause of our broken country. It is a symptom of broken transportation systems that we're admittedly improving. I mean,
yeah, I wrote it here, and I wrote it well. I don't like that the train stops at traffic lights still, but hey, it exists.
It exists, and people are shocked. You know, when until very recently, I was living without a car in LA. I did about 3 years without a car, and precisely,
totally doable, right?
Totally doable, but less convenient than having a car.
Sure. It doesn't hurt you to have a car here.
It doesn't hurt you to have a car, and that's why I think, you know, we're decades behind other cities, but it's completely doable to live in this city without a car, and that shocks people. Just the mere fact that it is an option for people.
In Los Angeles, it's funny because you talk to people about Los Angeles and the supposed car orientation, and you'll say, yeah, I'm sure you've had this conversation before. You'll say, no, it's totally doable without a car. And they'll respond like, but Los Angeles is the most car-oriented city in America. And if you think about it, really think about it clearly, is Los Angeles in the top 100 car-oriented cities in America? I think it's probably not. It's, depending what you call a city, but it's not at the bottom of the list. It's not the most car-y place. I mean, there's Phoenix, come on.
Sure. I think that part of that has to do with the fact that LA gets to tell its own story in its own way so many times that through Steve Martin's LA Story, where they literally have a scene where the joke is they get in the car, drive one block, and get out.
To some people, that's a grindingly neo-realistic movie. It's not a comedy.
Right. And I think that because that is some people's experience. I mean, this is a city of 10 million people. I mean, when you talk about, if you're going to say that you hate LA, and I might share your sentiment if we're talking about certain parts of LA or certain aspects or neighborhoods, yeah. But you have to be very specific because this is a huge place. It's not a huge city. It's a huge place. Like, this is my setup here. We're talking. We're at the Culver Hotel, which is 2 blocks from where I live. And the reason I moved here is precisely because it's so walkable. Precisely because I can walk to 2 grocery stores. I've got movie theater right here. I've got anything I could possibly need within this little space. Now, if I went and moved to, I don't know, some particular neighborhood on the east side that didn't have access to the train line,
Echo Park, I don't know.
Sure. It would be a very different experience. From here I can get down to the library. Of course, my nerdy example that I use all the time. I can get on the expo line, go down to the library, and be there in 20 minutes.
Right.
And then hop up to Hollywood for another 20 minutes. That blows people's mind that we have a rail line, that we have a subway.
Yeah.
Even within LA, because it is such a big city, and because some of the myths are true, because that's what's true for those people that moved here or are native for their experience. This is another perfect example of how it's so hard to classify generations and stereotype generations. It's also hard to stereotype, a city, and a city as big as this.
It's true, but tell me, what do you make of current visions of future Los Angeles? Because we're having another moment where people are envisioning what the future of Los Angeles is. A science fiction movie like Spike Jonze's Her, which I'm sure you saw. Didn't see? I was sure and wrong. But it's a vision of the Los Angeles future that there's not a car in it. And I heard from the production designer it's because cars always date sci-fi movies badly. Like,
sure.
Blade Runner looks great still, except those flying cars. But Her is a vision of Los Angeles where it's sort of toned down. It's not super heightened. I mean, they bring bits of Shanghai in to construct sort of a denser environment, a more transit-filled environment. But it's mostly about subtle changes, not enormous ones. I mean, do you have a sense of whether visions of the future of Los Angeles now, at least the ones you've seen, the ones you're aware of, are they more plausible, or will they turn out to be as wild, do you think, as any of them that we laugh about now, or that you write about on Paleofuture as an example of sort of wrong-headed thinking about the future that humanity seems to have always been doing?
The only thing I can say with any degree of certainty is that no one knows the future for certain.
Sure.
And that's a frustrating answer, I think, for a lot of people, because I've been doing this long enough that I know that I shouldn't be making predictions for the future.
Right.
But I do know that we are at as every generation is, at our turning point where we have to decide what we want as a society. And if your read on the future of Los Angeles happens to be one with fewer cars and more public transit, I applaud that. I think that's a great thing. To make that happen will require a lot of boring work.
Sure.
And that is... The future is so mundane and requires so much effort to make even the smallest positive change in the world that it can lead to this sort of nihilism that is... I try to pull myself back from.
But you can see it. You can see over the edge into the abyss.
Yes. I don't know how much longer I'll be in this city. Because I romanticize different aspects of the world for different reasons. And the one thing that I haven't found in LA yet is the utopia behind the sunshine and palm trees dystopia.
You expected there to be a utopia underneath?
Well, when you look at why people were moving out here in the 1910s, say, even though there was wild land speculation, people could get their own little plot of land. They'd build their bungalow, this thing that architects out in the East were ridiculing because it was, born of the arts and crafts movement, and it was this thing that, anyone could build. It was very do-it-yourself, and it was very homey, and just all the wrong things. It was not sophisticated. It was relaxed. It was, and I can't say that I've found the relaxed version of LA yet. This is as close as I get.
Feels pretty relaxed to me right now.
It does, and I love it. Like I love, the patio outside the Culver Hotel, which itself has some interesting history. I mean, they shot King Kong and Wizard of Oz and Gone with the Wind right there, and the Munchkins stayed in this hotel, and there's the mythology that John Wayne won this hotel on a bet, and it's got, LA has very interesting history, but this is as civilized as it feels to me right now. But there are many, many times, last night for instance, when I had to call the police because my neighbor with dementia was out screaming, "Help me! Help me! Help me!" and there was no way to. I've been going through this for the past couple of years. That my neighbor had a stroke and is suffering with dementia and does not have man of very little means and very little mind at this point. And I have done everything I can, in researching what can be done through county services or whatever to find him help. But every other night, he is out screaming and yelling and not knowing where he is, and reminding me that we live in a society that does not consider itself a society. We live in and I asked the cop last night, I rattled off the list of places I'd contacted to try and find him help, and the cop told me, well, it's a free country and you can move. And that was the answer to the question of where can I find him more help, was that I can move.
Telling response.
And that is what sort of breaks my spirit. And it's, again, not unique to LA. There are plenty of other places where the elderly can't get proper care when they're incredibly desperate and incredibly impoverished. But it's disheartening, and it makes a person like me romanticize getting a cabin in the middle of nowhere in Montana, like but that would be following LAPD's advice, move,
right,
rather than try and help or do anything to participate positively in the community that I live in. It's a certain feeling of helplessness that is, again, not unique to my time, not unique to my location, but it's something that really grates on you.
And it is from this dystopia, albeit a fascinating dystopia at times, of Los Angeles, that I've been coming to you speaking today with Matt Novak. He is the founder of Paleofuture, a site on the future's visions, the past's vision of the future, or you could say the future of the past of the future. What do you say?
I say past visions of the future.
That's catchier than what I'm stumbling over. Matt, thanks so much.
Well, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
This has been Notebook on Cities and Culture. I've been Colin Marshall. You can keep up with the cultural creators, internationalists, and observers of the urban scene on the show at colinmarshall.org. Thanks. Special thanks to everyone who backed Season 4 on Kickstarter, including Joel Neville Anderson, Daniel Levin Becker, Paige Calvert, Commander Manvark, Jonathan Crow, John Cunningham, David Dawes, James DeVito, Tim Dobbs, Paul Doyle, Jake Elliott, Kevin Emmett, Lawrence English, Jonathan Filbert, Andrew Philippone Jr., Michael Fransky, John French, Themistocles Eucrucius, Will Graham, Umberto Grant, Samuel Hansen, David Hayes, Jeff Hillenbrand, Mark Hines, Andrew Johnstone, Tadeusz Andrzej Kodlubowski, Peter Kavanagh, Ted Kane, Andy Cooney, Evan Landman, Alfred Lee, James Maloney, Sean McDonald, Alberto Bruzos Moro, Jason Miller, Rob Montz, Daniel Murphy, Richard Nash, Aidan Nullman, Patrick O'Flaherty, Danny Olson, Michael O'Regan, Ian Blosker, Christopher Porter, MJ Pritchett, Piers Rippey, Rob Schultz, Todd Shimoda, Cam Smith, Deborah Smith, Adam Sutherland, Maureen Kincaid Speller, Anna Traher, Thomas Interberger, Matt Warren, Nick Weigelt, Dion Wolf, Cynthia Yang, and Wayne Wright.